May 12, 1945, 4 days after Germany surrendered, Winston Churchill sat in his study at 10 Downing Street, writing the most urgent telegram of his life. It was addressed to Harry Truman, a man Churchill had met exactly once. The telegram contained a phrase that would define the next 50 years of world history. "An iron curtain is drawn down upon their front," Churchill wrote. "We do not know what is going on behind." Churchill was begging the new American president to understand what Roosevelt had refused to see. Stalin wasn't an ally anymore. He was a conqueror. And if America withdrew its forces from Europe as planned, everything the Western allies had fought for would be lost. To understand why Churchill was so desperate in May 1945, you have to understand what had happened between him and Franklin Roosevelt. The official story was that they were the closest of allies, brothers in arms against fascism. The reality was more complicated. Churchill needed Roosevelt. Britain was bankrupt, fighting alone against Hitler for 2 years before America entered the war. Without American money, American weapons, American troops, Britain would have been forced to negotiate with Hitler. Roosevelt knew this, and Roosevelt used it. Again and again, when Churchill and Roosevelt disagreed about strategy, Roosevelt sided with Stalin against Churchill. Not because Stalin was right, because Roosevelt was building a relationship with the Soviet dictator that he valued more than his friendship with Churchill. The pattern started at the Tehran Conference in November 1943. Churchill arrived with a strategy he believed could win the war faster: an invasion through the Mediterranean, up through Italy, possibly into the Balkans. Stalin hated this plan. He wanted the Western allies to invade France directly. Roosevelt had to choose. He chose Stalin. But it wasn't just the military decision that hurt Churchill, it was how Roosevelt handled it. The American president went out of his way to mock Churchill in front of Stalin. Roosevelt later bragged to his cabinet that he had gotten Stalin to laugh at Churchill's expense. "I kept it up until Stalin was laughing with me." Roosevelt said the ice was broken and we talked like men and brothers. Churchill sat in that room and watched the President of the United States humiliate him to curry favor with a communist dictator. He said nothing. He had no choice. Britain needed America too much. The Yalta Conference in February 1945 was supposed to plan the post-war world. Churchill arrived determined to secure free elections for Poland and Eastern Europe. Roosevelt arrived determined to get Stalin's agreement to join the war against Japan and participate in the United Nations. These goals were incompatible. Stalin wanted Eastern Europe as a buffer zone. He wasn't going to allow free elections that might produce anti-Soviet governments. Roosevelt didn't understand this, or didn't want to understand it. Churchill watched Roosevelt give away everything. The American president agreed that Poland's government should be friendly to the Soviet Union. He agreed to territorial concessions in the Far East. He agreed to formulations about free elections that Stalin could easily ignore. Churchill's doctor observed Roosevelt at Yalta and wrote that the president was a very sick man with only months to live. Churchill complained privately that the president is behaving very badly. He won't take any interest in what we are trying to do. The most damaging moment at Yalta came when Roosevelt's own interpreter watched the president take Stalin's side against Churchill repeatedly. Charles Bolin later wrote a devastating assessment. "I did not like the attitude of the president, who not only backed Stalin, but seemed to enjoy the Churchill-Stalin exchanges." Bolin recalled Roosevelt should have come to the defense of a close friend and ally who was really being put upon by Stalin. Roosevelt's belief, according to Bolin, was that ganging up on the Russians was to be avoided at all costs. This was, in Bolin's words, a basic error stemming from Roosevelt's lack of understanding of the Bolsheviks. Every time Roosevelt failed to support Churchill, Stalin learned that he could push harder. Every concession invited another demand. Roosevelt believed he could charm Stalin into becoming a responsible member of the international community. "I think I can handle Stalin," Roosevelt told Churchill. He was catastrophically wrong. Roosevelt's approach was based on a fundamental misunderstanding. He believed Stalin's hostility came from feeling excluded by the Western powers. If America showed trust and made concessions, Stalin would reciprocate. Stalin saw the world completely differently. To Stalin, concessions were signs of weakness. Trust was something to be exploited. Every time Roosevelt gave ground hoping for reciprocity, Stalin took the ground and demanded more. Churchill understood this. He had studied the Bolsheviks since 1917. But Roosevelt wouldn't listen. He was too invested in his vision of post-war cooperation with the Soviet Union. By early 1945, Churchill was so alarmed by Soviet behavior that he ordered his military staff to prepare a contingency plan for war against the Soviet Union. The plan was named Operation Unthinkable. The military assessment came back on May 22, 1945. The conclusion was devastating. Operation Unthinkable would likely fail. The Red Army was too strong. The Western Allies were too exhausted. The American public would never support continuing the war against a recent ally. Churchill filed the plan away, but the fact that he had commissioned it showed how desperate he was. Poland, which Britain had gone to war to defend in 1939, was about to become a Soviet satellite. So were Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. And Franklin Roosevelt, the man who should have helped Churchill prevent this, was dying. On March 23, 1945, 19 days before his death, Franklin Roosevelt finally admitted what Churchill had been telling him for years. "Averill is right," Roosevelt said. "We can't do business with Stalin. He has broken every one of the promises he made at Yalta." It was too late. Roosevelt was dying. He had no energy left to confront Stalin, and he had told his Vice President Harry Truman almost nothing about what was happening. Roosevelt met with Truman exactly twice during the 82 days Truman was Vice President. Both meetings were brief and ceremonial. Roosevelt never told Truman about the atomic bomb. He never briefed him on the Yalta agreements. He never explained the deteriorating relationship with Stalin. When Roosevelt died on April 12, 1945, Harry Truman inherited a world in crisis and knew almost nothing about it. Churchill wasted no time testing Truman. On May 6, 1945, before Germany's formal surrender, Churchill urged Truman not to withdraw American forces to the occupation zones agreed with the Soviets. "Use their position as leverage," Churchill argued. Truman's response was disappointing. America had given its word. He wasn't going to break that commitment. Churchill argued that circumstances had changed because Stalin had broken his word about everything else. Truman was unmoved. 6 days later came the Iron Curtain telegram. Churchill was pulling out every rhetorical weapon he had. An Iron Curtain is drawn down upon their front. We do not know what is going on behind. There seems little doubt that the whole of the regions east of the line Lubeck, Trieste, Corfu will soon be completely in their hands. For weeks, nothing happened. Churchill waited. The Red Army kept moving west. The Potsdam Conference in July 1945 was Churchill's first extended meeting with Truman. In those days, Churchill saw something that gave him hope. Truman was different from Roosevelt. He was direct, practical, and increasingly suspicious of Soviet intentions. He didn't try to charm Stalin. On the second day, Secretary of War Stimson showed Churchill a message. Babies satisfactorily born. The atomic bomb test had succeeded. America now possessed the most powerful weapon in human history. The dynamic at Potsdam had shifted. America was no longer dependent on Soviet help to defeat Japan. Truman had leverage that Roosevelt never had. Halfway through the conference, Churchill lost the British general election and had to leave. But he had seen enough. Truman understood what Roosevelt never did. After losing the election, Churchill returned to private life. He was 70 years old, watching helplessly as the Soviet Union consolidated control over Eastern Europe. Every warning he had given Roosevelt was coming true. Then in October 1945, Churchill received an invitation from Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri. It came with a handwritten note from Truman. "This is a wonderful school in my home state. Hope you can do it. I'll introduce you." Churchill recognized the opportunity immediately. This wasn't just a college lecture. This was a platform with the president at his side to say publicly what he had been saying privately for years. Truman read Churchill's draft on the train to Missouri. He approved every word. "It will do nothing but good," Truman said. He knew what Churchill was going to say. He wanted Churchill to say it. March 5, 1946, 8,000 people packed the gymnasium at Westminster College. 20,000 more gathered outside. President Truman sat on the platform as Churchill rose to speak. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent, Churchill declared. Behind that line lie all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe. Warsaw, Berlin, Prague, Vienna, Budapest, Belgrade, Bucharest, and Sofia. Churchill called for a special relationship between Britain and America to confront Soviet expansion. The Soviets, he said, admired nothing so much as strength and respected nothing so much as weakness. From the expression on Truman's face and his repeated applause, it was obvious he approved. This was the message he wanted delivered. Churchill was saying what Truman couldn't say himself. The reaction was explosive. Stalin called it war-mongering and compared Churchill to Hitler. The Wall Street Journal accused Churchill of poisoning relations with Russia. Protesters in New York chanted, "Winnie, Winnie, go away." Truman backed away publicly, telling reporters he hadn't known what Churchill was going to say. This was a lie. Truman had read and approved every word, but the political pressure was intense. Yet something important had shifted. Churchill's speech started a conversation Americans had been avoiding. Within weeks, George Kennan's long telegram began circulating, warning about Soviet intentions. Within a year, Truman announced the Truman Doctrine, pledging American support for nations resisting communist pressure. Churchill had trusted Truman to understand what Roosevelt refused to see, and Truman, despite his public equivocation, had understood perfectly. The Iron Curtain speech marked the beginning of the Cold War, but it also marked the beginning of the Western alliance that would eventually win it. The Marshall Plan rebuilt Western Europe. NATO created the military alliance Churchill called for at Fulton. The Berlin airlift showed America would stand firm. The Truman Doctrine committed America to containing Soviet expansion worldwide. None of this would have happened if Roosevelt had lived. Roosevelt believed he could work with Stalin. Roosevelt distrusted Churchill's warnings as British imperialism. Roosevelt thought he could build a post-war order based on cooperation with the Soviet Union. Truman understood what Churchill had been saying all along. Stalin only respected strength. Concessions invited aggression. The only way to prevent Soviet domination was unified Western power. Churchill had waited years for an American president who would listen. With Truman, he finally found one. Roosevelt failed Churchill. Truman did not.